just peacemaking? What about saying ways that we never have to deal with the issue of war? What if we don't have to get to that point? So let me go ahead and click this. We're talking about just peacemaking. And basically there are 10 points that are ways that can help us to be just peacemakers, to seek peace first before war. And the first, actually, is supporting nonviolent direct action, like we talked about last week. Think it one more time. You know, we've talked about this a lot. We've seen things from motion picture Gandhi, about the life of Gandhi, about Martin Luther King, you know, and that raised these things up. But often people kind of think like it ended there. You know, like those are the only two you think about. And I think Gandhi being the first in such a big thing in India, the British Empire, which ended shortly after, and King being our own country. But do you remember the Philippines? You know, the nonviolent movement that overthrew the dictatorship there. How about South Africa? You know, I remember in college watching movies about South Africa and the terrible oppression. You know, only 1 out of 10 people were white, but they controlled everything. You know, and the terrible violence that was done. And I remember saying, you know, if the actual Africans there rose up, there wouldn't be enough bullets to stop them from overtaking the whites. And I think maybe the whites thought about that. But the movement that Desmond Tutu and Mandela led was a nonviolent movement, and it was shocking to the world, I think, when apartheid, that keeping apart the whole way of being in South Africa ended. Do you remember East Germany? How many of you remember the fall of the wall? I mean, when I was in high school, we watched the movie. I remember it was like the after-school special with the family who makes the air balloon in their house to sneak over the wall at night. Do you remember this? It was a true story about the family who made so they could get over the wall, into West Germany, right? Yeah, or East-West Berlin. And who would have imagined that the fall of all that the Soviet Union would be without a shock? And think about it. You remember the movies we used to watch, the Cold War? The nonviolent direct action has really grown and is changing the world, and we just forget. It's like we don't notice all the ways this has been changing. So support this throughout the world. Number 2, take independent initiatives to reduce threat. Okay, it's a big phrase, but what does this mean? Well, basically you're saying that usually we say, if you do this, then we'll do this. Well, this is saying something different. Tim, one, we're just going to talk about actions, things that we're going to do, not just promises. Not I promise you this, saying they actually do something. All right? Next one. These are actions that are visible. They're announced with the intent to reduce the threat and distrust and invite actions in return. Say, so, like, you know what? We both want something. We're fighting over this territory. I'm going to step back. And if you don't step back, it's okay. I'm still stepping back. All right? So saying, I want to reduce threat. I'm going to try and invite you to do the same. Now, even if you don't do it, I'm going to do it. The next one. It doesn't leave the initiator weak. It doesn't mean I have to put down my weapons while you keep yours and then you can take care of me. It's saying I'm taking a step back, but it doesn't have to leave me in a place of vulnerability. Next one. It doesn't wait for the slow progress of negotiations. Right? We're going to talk some more. We're going to talk some more and say, no, we're going to do this even if you aren't willing to talk. Right? And we hope that we can get to that point. Next. It has announced timing that is followed no matter the response of the other side. So I'm stepping back here, even if you don't end the state, and you'll see it. Right? And it comes in a series, so that even if the other side fails to respond, the response continues to be invited. So say, I'm stepping back today. And I invite you to step back from this confrontation. And if you don't, the next day I'm going to take one more step back to show you I'm serious. Right? Next. This actually happened to Israel and Syria. I don't know how many of you remember that either, but Israel did that intentionally, withdrawing and saying we invite you in, and it worked. For our peace between Israel and Syria. I don't know. Have any of you heard the story of the donkey in the ditch? It's like a Jewish story. I forget it's the Talmud. Basically, it's a story of these two people, these two neighbors who weren't really neighborly. I mean, now how many of us find someone? There's always someone you meet you really don't like, right? Anybody have someone you just? And these two neighbors, they don't get along, and they really consider themselves enemies. And one day, one of the neighbors is walking down the road. And he sees his neighbor, and his neighbor has been walking his donkey on the road, and the donkey is falling into the ditch and can't get out. It's down in there. And it's going to take 2 people to get the donkey out. And he thinks to himself, well, this is my enemy. But in the scriptures it says that I'm supposed to love my neighbor. So even though he's my enemy, I'm going to help him get his donkey out. So he does. He helps him get his donkey out. Now the other neighbor, he thinks to himself, now this is really odd. He said, here this man I thought was my enemy, and he helps me get my donkey out of this. He must really be my friend. Right? I forget who put this quote on Facebook, but this many times before. Abraham Lincoln talked about, don't I destroy my enemy if I make them my friend? And he was one of the few presidents to actually put people in his cabinet who were from the other side, people who considered him the enemy, and just to bring healing. So saying, if we act like people are not our enemies, we love our enemies. This is what Jesus talked about. Next one. We also use cooperative conflict resolution. Jimmy Carter and Camp David Accords in Egypt and Israel. How many of you remember that? I remember that, boys. All right, good. Phil's been around. No one would ever thought that Israel and Egypt would get along at all, and they began to share and talk. I think about that story just sharing from Star Trek. And actually find that the enemy might actually want what you want. They actually want peace. Click this. And Jesus talks about this in Matthew 5:23. Oh, some of this big work. Go ahead. We said, therefore, if you are offering your gift at the altar and you remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift in front of the altar, and first go and be reconciled to that person, then come and offer your gift. All right? We've been talking about this a lot, but we thought about it on that level. So, even at national levels, international levels, we need to, if we have something against each other, we need to sit down and work it out before we go on with the rest of life. Next one. We need to acknowledge responsibility for conflict and injustice, seek repentance and forgiveness. All right? How many of you, have ever done something where you really didn't want to admit that you had some responsibility in that? Right? Have you ever actually been in some type of disagreement or brokenness in a relationship where you hadn't in some way contributed to it? Okay? Let's be honest, all right? So, we need to seek repentance and forgiveness. We need to say, I'm responsible too, and admit it. When I do premarital counseling, we do this 10 steps for conflict resolution. I just think it's so interesting. It's like the things if you think about it's common sense. But the first is, how did I contribute to this? And that's hard. It's really easy to say how you contributed to this. How do I do it? So some examples, actually during World War II, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a Lutheran pastor, was part of the Confessing churches, and they actually came out with a statement saying that we as churches in Germany had participated in what Hitler had done. We had supported it, and that was a sin, and said that. Or in South Africa, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. How many of you have heard of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission? Now this is interesting. We don't lift this up a whole lot. Basically, when apartheid ended, there were many people who disappeared. And there's this brokenness, and how were we going to deal with it, and the people who had done things, and who was going to actually come forward and admit they had done something that was terrible, that was legal at the time, but was completely unjust, which was horrifying in many cases. And what they did is they set up a commission which basically said this: if you come forward and share, you're not going to be punished for what you did, but people need to know what happened to their families. We want to seek reconciliation. And I remember a friend of mine sharing, he had been reading about this and said, the one woman came to him and said, I want to know who it was who killed my son, and found out it was a police officer who had done this and who it was. And she said, I want to know who it is so I can go to him to tell him I forgive him, and actually I want to invite him in to be part of my family because he obviously needs someone to help him on his journey. Right? Things that we think, in many ways, in our culture, that'd be impossible, but it's happening. Next one. Going to promote democracy, human rights, and religious liberty. All right? Okay, one more time. You know that during the 20th century, no country that had democracy, human rights, and religious liberty fought a war against another country with the same things. Right? Now, we have to be a little careful because we can be self-righteous, but for instance, in our country, we are in danger of becoming a plutocracy. Anybody know what plutocracy is? Do you know? That's a new word for you. You read the book. You read the book. Does anybody know what a plutocracy is?
No.
Huh?
What is it, Wayne?
Government controlled by money. I actually got a link this week that was showing that the majority of money that goes to politicians is given by the 5 richest Americans. Right? So we have to be careful about, do we really have a democracy, and raise that up. But then, I think that is a very powerful thing to say. When you actually encourage the people to have say, when you lift up human rights and religious liberty, the people are less likely, the countries are less likely to go to war against one another. Next one. To foster just and sustainable economic development. Now, this is really interesting, and we talk about this in the scriptures. You can go ahead and click the next one. In Korea and Taiwan, they're really encouraging individual land ownership, right? And so everyone sustains themselves. Whereas in Latin America, most land is owned, few individuals own large tracts of land, and so most people really live in poverty, almost like serfs, which is in many ways what it was like in the days of Jesus. That if everyone has a piece of land to support themselves, then they also contribute and they can support themselves. In fact, the year of Jubilee we were just singing about really was that. It was saying when they came to the land, God said everyone should have a piece of land so they can always support themselves, and the year of Jubilee was set up to make sure that it stayed that way, except no one followed it. The other thing, actually, Mary brought this to my attention, so really an interesting book on the third industrial revolution, talking about energy. Now, right now, where do you get your energy from? Huh? Well, yeah, I mean, but there's some company that actually is in charge of you getting your energy. Where what's happening around the world is people actually being able to produce it themselves. Like, imagine if you yourself produced the energy you needed. You know, that'd be interesting. Then there's freedom, and I think I put this on here. Oh, I put this. Well, I think backyard chickens fits this one a lot. I'm not, not just because I mean it just this essentially being able to support yourself. I think all those folks out there, right? You remember? I remember reading this woman during farm crisis. There was an interview about the farm crisis, and said, "What do you think about it?" She said, "Well, what do I care? I get my food from the grocery store." Right? We're tied through all these other processes. When I was in my first call, I was working with farmers who were trying to price their own milk. Because basically, you can't make a living. It's just interesting. If you go in the inner city, you don't make enough to buy your own milk, and if you're a farmer producing it, you can't live off of it. I remember the secretary at my first call. She was talking about how it costs more to raise a calf up to produce milk than you get out of it. And so this one guy, instead of trying to sell a calf, which is part of the process that makes you lose money, put 2 calves in the back of his pickup and said, "Calves free." Came back and he had 4 calves in the back of his pickup. It's true. This sense people need to be able to support themselves and not lose because of it. So. The next ones, I think, are things we need to include our enemies in the community of neighbors.